Hi everyone. So I don't speak German, but I assume I can. God help us all, because two of my projects are in video format. So today I want to talk about the art of compromise, but what I mean by this is not compromise in the sense of meeting things halfway. To me, the reality of building and of working with novel technology is mostly about bridging between what you conceptually think you want and then addressing local issues within their own context. And I think that's a very important lesson, especially when you build for real humans or non-humans that have very specific needs. This is a project in mainland China that I'm not going to start with it, actually I'm going to end with it, but is a project that my expectations of what I imagine it will be building in a village in China and what was the reality of bringing a robot there and building were very different. And I think it's very important to always approach projects with an open mind. I personally never know what a project is going to be when I start it. Rather, I prefer to go there and learn from the sites and from everything that is on the sites. Because I think when you don't do that, when you go in projects with a preconceived notion, you end up with very naive interpretations of projects. This is an arch daily comment from someone I think is maybe my biggest fan. But I think this kind of what people maybe think is brutal honesty is very good because it helps you understand how far the reality is from what we think that a good project is that has to tick boxes. I have to use sustainable materials, I have to do this and that. But actually, I think a good project is about who is involved in it and how it is built, and how do you connect with everything that is on site, everything that is local, how your project is used after it's finished, and if it's a renovation in this case, how you create a connection between the past, the present, and the future, and what's your take on speculating what this future is. And of course, the biggest advantage, in my opinion, of technology is that it allows us to work within a world that is overbuilt without having to tear things down, but working upon what we already have. And I want to show a little bit, I'm going to try to give a quick background on how I arrived at these conclusions. So the first project I want to present today is it's not the official title of the project, but today I framed all my projects as houses because all of them house something. So this is a performative coral habitats, but I named it Underwater House, and I was lucky enough to have this as my first ever client. A client from which I learned very much, and I was very humbled. So this project was a collaboration between the Marine Biology Department at Hong Kong University and the Architecture Department. And it was about, after 2018 when there was a very strong typhoon in Hong Kong that damaged about 80% of local coral habitats. So we wanted to create habitats in which we could place little fragments of corals and they could grow together, but the habitat would have a sustainable way of disappearing without damaging underwater conditions. So we had to bridge together the natural component, which is actually always changing. Nature is not something static. Even underwater, the coral species, there's never the same predominant species, they always change. And then we had to mix the machining component that has its own behavior, and then the human component, because this project was a grant from the government, but it was going to be deployed underwater by amateur divers. So we had to make sure that we create a system that is easy enough so that someone untrained to stay underwater in large periods of time can take it underwater and assemble it. So this was kind of the system that we created. Each tile is actually identical, even though with computational design and robotic fabrication, you have a lot of possibility of tailoring geometries. Actually, each tile had to be identical in order to be able to trace the results. So if the tile would have been different, we wouldn't have known as some of them perform better or some of them perform worse, if that's coming from the geometry or from the corals themselves. And we had to do a lot of tests, of course, when you print with clay, which is a material that has its own behavior, that shrinks. There's a lot of calibration to be done, and we had to do a lot of calibration in terms of the tiles are formed out of two layers. The bottom layers, which cannot be solid because Hong Kong has urbanized reef, so there's a lot of sedimentation, so you need to make sure the corals don't get suffocated, so the sediment needs to be able to pass by. And then we had to test different geometries in order to make sure that the corals can grow within the geometries that we created. And this is the corals, the coral fragments when we originally deployed them. This is a little bit afterwards. This is after about 6 to 8 months, and this is after a couple of years. And right now, most of the coral fragments have become a coral habitat by themselves, and they don't need the tiles anymore to survive. So the tiles, because they're clay, they're gonna slowly decompose within 3-4 years, and they're not gonna damage underwater condition. Actually, they can be digested by various species that live in the specific water. And happy client, happy designer. And the next project is the Oyster House, which actually is not a finalized project. And it's a project combining 2 materials and 2 sites. These 2 materials are, and each material has its own form of fabrication. So there's clay printing, and we've created specific tiles that we use as planters, and we have a two-layer wall system. And then we're using casting using oyster shells. And the reason is, as I mentioned, we're working with 2 sites. The first site is the Cheung Chau Island in Hong Kong. It's one of the outskirting islands of Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, something that I discovered is that actually nature and the built environments don't need to compete. There's various ways in which they can coexist. And sometimes nature overtakes the built one, and sometimes humans adapt to nature, but there's always this meeting of 2 worlds that's done somewhat peacefully, to say so. And even though we think about Hong Kong as a metropolis full of skyscrapers, actually more than 60% of the city is a natural park. And then it's bringing together another posture of Hong Kong, which is the city is a city revolving around the dinner table. The dinner table is the most important thing. It's a city of eating. But that, of course, comes with its own implication. More than 30% of the waste in Hong Kong is actually coming from food waste. And there's very little strategies of dealing with this. So initially when I discovered this, I was starting to do a lot of tests with my students and seeing if you can use various food waste as a material for 3D printing. I'm not going to get into that part of the work right now. But then I discovered Laofaoshan territories. So Laofaoshan is an urban village, to say so. So it's neither rural nor urban entirely. But it's a fisherman village in Hong Kong, right at the most northern point of Hong Kong. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of fishermen who harvest oysters every day. And the problem is that the oysters get sold, only the eatable oyster gets sold, and then all the shells are just simply discarded in the village, and they become trash. So even though the oyster shell itself is not an unsustainable material, the fact that it's not discarded properly attracts a lot of issues such as pests and odor, and attracts even more garbage, basically. This is Laofaoshan. And people have kind of naive interpretations of what they could do with the oyster shells. But actually, there used to be a lot of intelligence in working with this natural material. So in Cantonese architecture, for about 600-700 years, oyster shells have been used for their compressive strength and for their insulating properties. And there's a lot of examples of oyster architecture in South China, basically in Cantonese-speaking areas of China. And when I went to sites, another reality that I had to deal with was that to get a building permit in Hong Kong is near to impossible, because there's a lot of impossible regulations, one of which the strongest one is typhoon proofing. So anything that you want to build, you need to get a special permit to have a licensed engineer to attest that your project will sustain even the strongest typhoon. And that actually sometimes can take years to build. So I thought about how I can sneak around this and how I can make my own reality in order to build something on the site. And I discovered this abandoned sheds, and the regulation actually says that as long as you don't go out of the footprint of an original building, you can alter it as much as you want, and you don't change it structurally. So I decided to create a system to keep the original structure of the building intact, and then only work with the envelope of it and the inside of it, and to combine these two techniques, the oyster casting and the 3D printing. I would like to play a video.
Seems like you have to log in with your own account. Or you have to give us permission to view it because it's on my account.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I already gave permission. Okay.
You have to check your phone.
My phone.
I think that was the message before.
Okay.
I mean, it should have worked.
Now it should be.
No, it's not working.
I'm not receiving the request.
Yeah, can you log in?
Sure,
Your
sure.
account?
Where's the...
Ed.
Yeah, sorry. I hope I remember my Gmail password.
That's why I didn't want to ask.
The reality of technology is that it's not always convenient.
Now we just should have been. Now you have to select it here again.
I hope I have nothing too embarrassing.
You can close the sharing.
At this point, I'm fully exposed. I know what everyone's thinking. It better be a pretty good film. I hope I won't disappoint. There's no sound. So since there's no sound, I will be an impromptu narrator. I think this is my karmic punishment for trying to be lazy and just show you guys film that were beautifully narrated and had beautiful music. So there's always a price to pay when you're trying to get shortcuts. So this is the site in Hong Kong, the site where we are building. It's a natural park, as I mentioned, in the outskirting islands of Hong Kong. And this is in Laofashan territories where there's the fisherman village. These are my lovely students. since the sound is not working, I think it's a bit underwhelming to just watch it, so I'm going to try to scroll a little bit faster through it. And the whole Laufauschan territory is basically, it's a whole village where you can find oysters anywhere. There's oyster trash in people's gardens, on the streets, next to the water, everywhere. So we were going with students there, taking the oysters and then bringing them back to university campus and doing the oyster casting, while simultaneously also 3D printing using 6-axis printing and ceramic clay. And we had to use a lot of different ways of transporting this. So we had to be very creative in how we thought about the building process. We couldn't just do everything, pack it, and send it on site because we have to pass through 3 islands in order to reach the site. We harvest the oysters in the northern island of Hong Kong. Then we go on campus, which is the main island in Hong Kong. And then we had to go to another little island. And for the little island, we also had to take 2 different ferries. The big ferry, and then a smaller sampang boats in order to reach our site. So we had to always be very creative in how we transport things, how we manage to break things down and take a lot of people with us, so each of us can take a little part of the project with them. Finding materials locally in this little island where the site is. So we had to find basically sifus, which are kind of old school type of masters who are working with their crafts, and we had to buy material from them, and we had to kind of involve them in the process as well. And this is the project is not finished. We're in 1-to-1 scale prototyping right now, but we did want to test the oyster casting in a 2-meter tall wall, and then the 3D printing system. And I think I will just go quickly through the video. And maybe I can yeah, and basically then the plants were also from the same village. We tried to buy the succulent plants that nobody is buying, that they seem like they're dying, because the site is a natural park and it's all about ecological building, harvesting and growing their own food, taking care of stray animals. So we really had to be very respectful of the ethos of the projects. And something that I maybe forgot to mention is that each project that I'm showing today has a different funding scheme. So I think also part of the reality is building is to be creative with the ways in which you find funding for your projects and how you make sure that you still have enough agency, even though you maybe have a financial dominator over you. And the third transportation mode was, of course, biking for the students. Once we didn't have to carry anything heavy anymore, of course. And this brings me to the project that I started with today, Traditional House of the Future. So this project was a collaboration between me and another colleague in Hong Kong University, also in the architecture department. But we came from seemingly very different worlds. So my world was about digital fabrication, robotic fabrication, on-site and off-site fabrication, very little to do with humans actually, and more related to the environment. And my colleague John Lin's work revolves around investigations in rural China, of course building himself, but also by the time when we collaborated on this project, he had just finished writing a book called Asphalt Houses, which followed and investigated how spontaneous builders, untrained or trained in China, are reimagining traditional Chinese houses. And one of the particular interests was in the traditional wooden house, which is actually very easy to take apart and build back together. So there's a lot of these weird, they almost seem like collages between the old and the new, and the way in which people use their own houses. In this truck, that's actually a house that someone is taking with the truck to another village. And you can see there's always this tension between the old and the new, and even though it's very clear which is which, they still find a way to coexist. And this is an example from Shangri-La, where there's a lot of earth architecture and then a lot of these new additions working with steel and glass. This is the house of a local businessman, aka a mobman. He starts his morning in this room, which is the contemporary part of the house. And then by lunch, he moves to this space, which is half traditional, half modern, and he ends his days, his nights, in the most traditional part of the house where he lives with his family. So this was something that was very important to us, to take into consideration how people live and how they use these houses, and to create a mix between the old and the new. I'm going to show another video, but I'm prepared to talk on top of this one, so it won't be sort of...
You only have the sound from the mobile in the microphone?
This one is okay without sound.
Yeah?
But
Okay.
So the project is located in Guizhou province, which is in southwest mainland China. And it's a government initiative. So the story of the village is actually that slowly the village is getting abandoned. It's a village with traditional wooden houses, and they're getting slowly abandoned for the neighboring village, in which it's all generic concrete buildings. But people are moving there because they don't have financial incentives to stay in their own village, and because the traditional house doesn't respond to their needs anymore. So we were actually, me and my colleague, we were teaching together at the time in year 2 in Hong Kong University undergraduates. And we did a series of interviews and surveys with our students, with the local villagers, trying to put together a design brief with the local people. And when you're working with villagers, it's not this kind of hippie, romantic idea that we can have of the village. People are very aware of what they need, and we created a design brief together with them. And the most important thing for them was to have modern amenities, and to have an incentive to stay in the village. So the way that the government responded to that was to create this house that they contacted us for. That would create a focal point in the village, a tourist attraction, and what we actually managed to do was, through the building process, to create a financial incentive for the village, because we had almost all participants from the village involved in it. We have the government, then we had trained craftsmen, traditional woodworkers, and untrained villagers. So the villagers were already self-financing themselves. So this is not an official Taobao village. Taobao is a platform similar to Amazon, but there are people who are working for Taobao in it. And they were basically trying to fund themselves to stay in the village. As I mentioned, traditional Chinese wooden houses it's possible to tear them apart and build them back within one day. They use no screws, no additional, everything is done through the way that the joinery is done. So we decided to scan the original house and then adapt the 3D printing part to the original house. That meant that we could completely reuse everything that was original. We simply reconditioned it, and some parts of it had to be chopped off, but the house was put together using only the original wood. And there's something very similar in the way that traditional woodworkers and robots work, which is not something that you would expect, but we both, let's say both worlds do not really require the use of drawings. So the traditional wood craftsmen, they are working based on models. So we had to make small mock-up models and send it to them and discuss with them. And the robot, of course, operates based on code. So even though you may need a geometry, you don't need a drawing. So that was something very interesting to see. It's how to create a one-to-one scale project, a real house, without having any construction drawings. And it also required a lot of adaptation from both sides. So there was always this continuous loop between us working with the robots and the craftsmen. Because the way that traditionally these wooden houses are done is that you create the structure flat on the ground and then you simply erect it. But because we scanned it and then we 3D printed everything in order to account for every little imperfection in the columns and create all these little nooks in the walls in which you can basically insert the original column, they couldn't do that. So they also had to adapt their way of working and create ways of redoing the frames, reworking within the walls that we have created. So there was never an end or a beginning or an end to the construction process. It was always this loop between us. As I mentioned, even untrained villagers were involved in the construction process, not only the ones that helped us assemble the roof and do the roof tiling, but also the ones who were cooking, who were cleaning, who were doing the waterproofing, because of course nothing ever works perfectly according to schedule, so we didn't manage to finish building during the dry season. So part of the house was actually built during the wet season, and we needed a lot of help from the local villagers to waterproof everything. The new addition to the house made it possible to go from a one-story house to a two-story house. The original house was quite tall, but the ground level was only for animals. But people don't grow animals anymore in the village, so we decided to transform ground floor and also, let's say, human space. So we added all these modern amenities that people were mentioning that they need and they don't have, and that's especially for people with children. It's a very big reason why they leave the village. So we created a bathroom, a modern kitchen, a courtyard, a living room, gathering space. Also, we try to take into consideration how all generations live. And it's quite common in this area that houses are multi-generational, so you would need at least 2 free bedrooms because there's usually 2 free generations living in the house. And you need a generous gathering space because that's part of the way in which people live. And also we try to incorporate within the 3D printing, well, there's no plants yet because the project was just finished when we did it, but the curly wall is basically a planting space for them to plant everything that they might need in a little vertical garden, and then to incorporate a stove and all these appliances that they might need within the 3D printed geometry. So that helped us also a lot to maximize the space in the house. And something that we also wanted to do from the beginning was not to try to fully integrate the 2 worlds, but to have it very clear which one is which. Because one of the requirements from the government was that they want for someone coming from the outside in the village to really think about this village as a place of innovation. That was something that the village head was very adamant about, and they were very open about us using cutting-edge technology. So they were very welcoming to the fact that we brought all these robots on site and doing the scanning and the drone filming. We received actually a lot of support, not only from the local government, but from the people themselves. People are very curious about technology, and there's always this interesting mix. We're all very affected by technology, but how often do we actually benefit from it? And we think we benefit from it, but when you actually think about these areas and where basically technology is produced, it's an interesting way to rethink your own relationship and your own expectations out of technology. We can claim it's unsustainable and we can wait for it to fix everything, but I think it's more up to us to mediate this relationship. And with this robot leaving, I will simply add a few more slides and then I'm done. I'm not sure if I'm over time. I'm sorry if I am. Following this project, the next and the project is nominated for the Design Awards and the World Architecture Awards, so please send us some good thoughts. And the next project we are working on, and this project is literally just being started, it's the underground house of the future, in which we're working with another traditional Chinese topology, the underground house. The underground houses are in northern China, and right now they're going through something that was not possible to be accounted for, which is climate change. So a lot of the houses are being damaged because it didn't used to be an area with a lot of flooding, and now they are experiencing a lot of flooding because of climate change. But people still use these houses in the modern ways. But also the houses that seem like they're being abandoned, they're still occupied. This is a house that the inhabitant his generation has owned this house for the last 500 years, and he is still living there. And this is his current bedroom / living room / kitchen. And we are working now on a project which will create new rooms and new openings towards these rooms perimetrally, and a completely new courtyard system in which to transform the space into something that is called Red and White, which is basically dedicated to funerals and weddings, but it's not a public space. It's still owned by the family. They just do everything within the house that they own. Sorry for the bad pictures. They've been sent by the constructor. And we're creating, again, the mix of traditional techniques using traditional brick vaulting techniques and robotic fabrication on site. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions from the audience for Lidia? Well, I will keep my breath.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation, very exciting. I have a question regarding your oyster project, because it wasn't fully clear, like the oysters that you gathered, you used it just for molding, or also mixed it somehow with clay for the printing?
No, it's simply for casting the oysters. It's two separate systems. We did try oyster printing. The problem is that since it's a project for an actual beneficiary, we cannot really risk that much. So we didn't really manage to get on time a good oyster mix that could both be printed and be durable enough. We did get some prints, quite good ones, but in the Hong Kong climate that is very, very humid, and that about 6 months per year it's the wet seasons, we couldn't risk using them on site.
Thank you.
Well, I will ask a question. In all your project, I think the material formulation is probably quite sensitive. You've told us about how the clay in the reefs dissolves in the end. I'm guessing printing in that kind of context with a potential humidity and the whole environment changing could also affect the printing. I was wondering how you work with the formulation, what part it plays in your work and how you tackle it.
So for the on-site projects, first of all, it's concrete, it's not clay. So to begin with, the material is much more durable, and there's a special way of treating concrete. We had in the team that was printing so part of the story of the project is that this project was done during COVID when we could not go to China. So we had another team from Professor Shu Weiguo from Shenzhen that was printing for us, and within their team they have a material science department that made sure that the house would be able to survive the climate in southern China, southwest China.